There comes a moment when you realize that the silence inside your own mind is no longer peaceful, but thick with an unspoken tension. You begin noticing a strange persistence in your moods, a sudden irritability over a misplaced object, or a wave of disproportionate resentment when a colleague makes a harmless remark. Most people never notice that these minor psychic eruptions are not reactions to the external world at all, but the first demands of an internal stranger who has been denied a voice. What you thought was simply fatigue or stress is often the initial creaking of the floorboards beneath your conscious personality, signaling that something you have disowned is trying to catch your eye. It is not difficult to observe how readily you turn away from these moments, adjusting your posture, checking your phone, or launching into a new task to silence the murmurings of the unseen self. But the psychological reality is uncompromising, because whatever is refused admission into the ego does not dissolve, but merely retreats into the darkness where it gathers weight and momentum. When you consistently ignore yourself, you are not maintaining peace, but are instead financing a silent rebellion within your own psyche. You might notice this exposure in the quiet aftermath of a dinner party or a casual conversation, where you find yourself replaying a single sentence you spoke, wondering if you sounded foolish, or feeling a sudden, unexplained wave of shame. This discomfort is the shadow tapping you on the shoulder, pointing out the vast distance between the polite, accommodating persona you presented to the room and the raw, unpolished truth of what you actually felt. The person who always agrees, who smiles through their exhaustion, or who assumes the role of the perpetual helper is often the one most haunted by an undercurrent of bitter, unprovoked anger. You feel exposed not because someone has discovered your secret, but because your own psychological equilibrium is failing, forcing you to look at the resentment you have carefully hidden behind a mask of virtue. The mask is beginning to pinch, and the flesh beneath it is growing raw from the constant pressure of performance. The hidden mechanism operating beneath this experience belongs to the laws of psychic energy, which dictate that no instinct or emotional truth can be destroyed without an equal and opposite reaction in the unconscious. When you deliberately turn your back on your own vulnerability, your ambition, or even your capacity for malice, that psychic energy is forced to find a back door, often returning as an autonomous force that seems entirely separate from who you believe you are. I have often seen this take the form of a black dog following silently behind a traveler, unnoticed in the bright sunlight of daytime activity, but becoming louder and more menacing the moment the traveler stops to rest in the evening. This animal is not an external enemy, but the personification of your own neglected life force, which has grown wild and feral simply because it has been excluded from the warmth of your conscious attention. The more you pretend the animal is not there, the more its growl fills the silence, transforming your inner landscape into a place of perpetual vigilance where you must constantly run to stay ahead of your own nature. This mechanism becomes highly visible in your daily interactions, particularly in the way you unconsciously select certain people to carry the very traits you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. You might find yourself intensely irritated by a companion who speaks loudly, acts selfishly, or demands attention without shame, feeling a moral outrage that seems entirely justified by their bad manners. What you are actually experiencing is the shock of recognition, as your unconscious projects your own buried desire for self-assertion onto the canvas of another person. They are living out the very impulse you have starved within yourself. And your fury is not a sign of your moral superiority, but a symptom of your envy. Human beings adapt to access, and when you deny yourself access to your own power or your own shadow, You become deeply resentful of anyone who accesses theirs with ease. The shadow becomes louder because it uses the voices of those around you to scream the truths you are too polite to whisper to yourself. One begins to suspect that this inner voice gains its terrifying volume precisely because it uses your own vital energy as its fuel. Every time you swallow an authentic response to maintain an illusion of harmony, that unspent emotional force is handed directly to the unconscious, where it is forged into a weapon against your own ego. You may experience this in a sudden shift in someone's tone during a routine meeting, where a minor criticism causes your heart to race and your mind to spiral into self-defense. The intensity of your reaction reveals that the external critic has accidentally aligned with your own internal executioner, the shadow that has been judging your cowardice from the dark. What you thought was a secure, well-managed life reveals itself to be a brittle fortress, constantly threatened by the return of everything you have swept under the rug. The disturbing thing is that you cannot bargain with this hidden force, because it knows your vulnerabilities intimately, having been constructed from the very pieces of yourself you judged too dangerous or too shameful to keep. This realization brings about a profound collapse of illusion, forcing you to recognize that the image you have presented to the world is largely a fiction maintained at an unsustainable psychological cost. You had believed that by being reasonable, by suppressing your envy, and by outrunning your darker impulses, you were becoming a good person. But you see now that you were merely becoming an unconscious one. This fracture often manifests in a moment of delayed realization, perhaps hours after a small betrayal disguised as reasonableness occurred. When you finally look into a cracked mirror and realize you do not recognize the eyes staring back at you, the false certainty of your moral performance dissolves, leaving you with the uncomfortable truth that your righteousness was often just a fear of conflict, and your kindness was merely a negotiation for safety. You can no longer pretend that the anxiety humming beneath your skin is a medical anomaly or a temporary stressor, as it is undeniably the sound of your unlived life protesting its imprisonment. The psyche now exerts a tremendous individuation pressure, demanding that you stop identifying with the mask and begin the painful process of integrating the stranger in the basement. This pressure does not feel like a gentle invitation, but like a heavy, isolating weight that separates you from the casual certainties of the crowd around you. You find that you can no longer participate in the shared illusions of your social circle, and a room becoming quiet after you speak is no longer a social failure, but a sign that your emerging clarity is disrupting the comfortable slumber of others. The unconscious is forcing a confrontation, demonstrating that if you will not consciously look at your own capacity for rage, greed, or ambition, it will introduce you to these traits through a series of humiliating mistakes or uncontrollable moods. People become attached to the version of you they learned how to navigate, and as the shadow forces its way to the surface, you must face the reality that your relationships will change when you stop confirming their expectations. Ultimately, you are left standing in the quiet of your own psychological reality, understanding that the shadow is not an enemy to be conquered, but a sibling who has been starved. The black dog that has followed you through the long night does not want to tear you apart, but simply refuses to be left behind any longer in your desperate pursuit of an idealized perfection. You begin to see that true wholeness requires a terrifying descent into your own contradictions, where you must own the very things that make you look imperfect in the eyes of the collective. The loud, disruptive murmurs of your ignored self will only quiet down when they are given a seat at the table of your conscious awareness, allowed to speak their raw, uncomfortable truths. This is not a journey toward comfort or reassurance, but a movement toward a gravity that accepts the full weight of human nature, both its light and its necessary darkness,